Well, g'day everybody. Welcome to another video. To my subscribers, good to see you again. And if you're new to the channel, g'day. Today we're going to talk about RAW format, and RAW format as opposed to JPEG or TIFF or any of the other image file formats, and why you should be using RAW in your camera settings. So for all you artists out there that are thinking or use your camera to shoot reference for reference scenes or textures and so on and so forth, you want to be shooting RAW. And I'll explain why. Let's say you've got this shot here. This is a standard shot. It's a JPEG, and I might want to see a little bit more in the shadows of this particular photograph here. So let's get a curves control and let's bump up the shadows and get some information in those shadows. Now, as you can see, I'm seeing a lot more in the shadows. There's a lot of information in there, but my highlights and everything in the light side of that scene is getting overly bright. So we're going to try and compensate for that if we can. Somewhat washed out and somewhat strange going on here. We've lost a lot of the blacks. We've accomplished our goal of seeing more into the shadows here. That's great, but somewhat at the expense of the lit portion of the scene. There's a couple of ways to accomplish this type of thing in Photoshop, and I'm not going to go into anything overly detailed, but let's just say we want to open up those shadows a little bit, and we want to retain what's going on in the light side. We can basically just erase that light side, thus retaining the best of both worlds. So I now have this portion of the frame that is a combination composite of those two sections, and I can probably take or add some color balance changes to the shadow side and make it a little cooler. That's one way of getting and achieving that situation. It's a multi-step process, and once you've got your shadow area to where you like it, there's not a lot you can do with it afterwards. The more you work this area, the more you're going to start to lose quality. And doing this on a JPEG, you've really only got so much to play with. That's it. It's done. You can't go back and rechange this. You can't go back to, you can go back and save or duplicate the original JPEG file and work on a copy. That would be smart. But you really can't do much with that JPEG. You can only go so far with it. So what can you do? What would be better than working on a JPEG? Well, I'm glad you asked. Actually, I won't get rid of that. Let's leave that there. And what I'm going to do is open Bridge and open up. This is the RAW file. Okay, so this is the Camera Raw interface. This is the latest interface. Now, what we have, think of the RAW file as a digital negative. The negative is never changed. If you were thinking or talking in terms of film negatives, the negative would be put in a sleeve, tucked away in a folder, and put away. You can always come back to that negative. You can always pull it out and use it to reprint another photo over and over and over again. And because it's a negative, you could put it into an enlarger and you can print it in many, many different ways. That's pretty much what a RAW file is. So we have all these controls on the right-hand side here. I've got an exposure control. So I've got an enormous amount of, as you can see, the actual amount of data in that RAW file is staggering. So much detail. This is almost now light, as if it was in sunlight. All the way down to almost black. So RAW is basically whatever amount of light goes into the camera and hits that sensor, that's it. It captures everything. What you see as a JPEG on the back of the camera or as a review image is simply that. It's a JPEG derived from the RAW and presented to you as a review image. So it does not contain all of that data. And as I'll explain a little bit later, you can save the RAW file alongside a JPEG file if you like. We can play with the exposure control here and we can say, oh great, let's see more in those shadows. But as you can see, it brightens up the light side, which we don't want. So let's take it back to 0. And let's play with these other settings here. We've got one called highlights and one called shadows. If we lift the shadows, it lifts the shadows. We could also tone down the highlights all the way down. Now, in terms of quality, image quality, this is a far better result than anything you can get by manipulating a JPEG straight out of your camera. Now we can still continue to play with exposure. We can also, and this is one of the really cool features about RAW, is that we can alter the overall color temperature. We can go from warm to cool, very, very warm, to very, very cool. And the number up here relates to the color temperature in Kelvin. You can bias it towards green or magenta if you like as well. We'll leave that set to 0. The camera raw panel here in Photoshop also tells me what ISO I was shooting 250 ISO. It tells me the lens I was using, the aperture, and the shutter speed. And it allows me to, if we click on optics down here, when I hit use profile corrections, it automatically knows that I was using a Nikon and it knows what lens I was using. So it will correct for all that sort of curvature and distortion introduced by the lens itself. So that's one thing that RAW or the RAW settings allow you to do. We'll turn that off for the time being. We can increase saturation, we can decrease saturation. We can take it all the way to black and white if I like. I won't worry about these guys here, these particular settings. I'll leave these two alone as well. I want to make this quick. I don't want to linger too long on this because I want to show you some of the pictures. But suffice to show you some of the power of what's available to you when using RAW. So let's pull those highlights back up a little bit just to give this left side, the light side, a little bit more light. And we'll hit open. And there is our RAW version. Now I want you to look at something else as well. Look at the quality of the general tones and so on in this tree and in this area compared to the JPEG version. There's so much more fidelity and clarity and information in this compared to the JPEG. You can achieve the exact same thing in one pass, in one setting, with the camera raw settings. If you're using Lightroom, Lightroom has the same type of settings. There is other software that allows you to open up raw files. So that is one of the great benefits of, let me go back to that. It's one of the great benefits of shooting RAW. It is absolutely phenomenal in how much your camera can capture in the shadow areas and in the highlight areas. So speaking of highlight areas, let's have a look at something quite challenging for a camera. This is a nighttime scene of the New Year's Eve fireworks over Sydney Harbour, and that's Sydney Harbour Bridge there. When I shot this, I've obviously exposed more for the fireworks than the landscape. But let's have a look and see what we can do by lifting some of this up. So if we push the shadows up, there's not much of an effect actually. Maybe it's too dark. So let's push it up with exposure. Can we get more in the landscape with exposure? Yes, we can. We can get an enormous amount in there. The only problem is noise and grain. The more you lift it up from blacks like that, the more you're going to see noise. So that's the downside to that, to a really dark image anyway. But by lifting that exposure way up, what we've done is we've blown out a lot of the fireworks here. They're just a little bit too bright. So we can pull those down with that highlight control and we can take them all the way down actually. We don't want to go all the way down because they are bright and that's part of their charm. But we can drop it down enough so we get a more balanced. And you can also see this train station in the foreground here. Just pay attention to the lights in there. Let's actually look down there, shall we? So you can see the difference between just dropping that highlight. So we don't want to go too low, otherwise it looks fake. We want to give it some sense of glow. So this truly is the power of RAW. It's amazing. Given the type of shot, given that it was nighttime, given that it's very high ISO, it's going to be very grainy or very noisy. So that's to be expected for this type of shot. But shooting this type of situation with JPEG would be near impossible to get a balance. Now, you don't have to have the top line Nikon camera to get this effect. You can have smaller, more compact cameras that shoot RAW. Plenty of cameras shoot RAW these days. When you're shooting skies, one of the biggest problems with shooting skies is the imbalance of the landscape across the bottom, and it could be up here, it doesn't matter where your landscape is, but the sky above, which is going to be quite bright compared to the landscape. Even in a situation like this storm, where there's this area of sky here and in here that is quite bright, and we might want to balance that out. So again, this is without playing with exposure, by the way. Now, playing with exposure and pulling that down tells us how much information we've got. We've got lots of information in there, so we know we're okay. This isn't blown out, hasn't been clipped. It's in pretty good shape. So we'll leave that set to 0. We can play with that and balance that as we need. We can also lift the shadows. You can see that difference across the bottom of the landscape there. So once again, you can really get a nice balance of tones and values within your shot. Now, here's the beauty of RAW. RAW allows me to go back to the original source file and make more changes, to do something different with it, to decrease the contrast, to change the color temperature, any number of things. And this is before I'm getting into any of the more complex color controls and curves and that type of thing. So just using these couple of sliders here is more than enough for an artist to get their images into a much better looking position than what you would get shooting straight from JPEG. So if you're an artist wanting to take photographs of a landscape that maybe you're out there shooting, painting plein air, and you want to shoot some reference of the scene before the light changes, it's absolutely imperative that you shoot RAW, because this is more likely what you will see with the human eye. The camera sees this. The camera most definitely sees this. It's very contrasty. It cannot deal with those two extremes, whereas the human eye can deal with those extremes. So it's always helpful to shoot your landscapes in RAW if you're going to do a little painting and a bit of manipulation of the work, or if you're going to do a little continuation of the painting work in your studio after you've been outside. Maybe you've only got time, or the light is very brief, the light's disappearing rapidly. You've got maybe 3 minutes to paint something like that, and you want to capture the moment. Shoot it in RAW, take it back home, open it up in RAW, and extract out that information, and that'll give you a much better place to begin with if you want to continue working on a painting in the studio. Some images will actually challenge RAW because there's just too much of a bright spot, too much of a dark area. Even a camera is fallible. The human eye is still infinitely better at capturing the limitations, or that vast difference between light and dark. And again, we can color balance that, change the color balance any way we like. We could warm it right up. So this is one of the storm shots. I would never ever go back to shooting film. Not when you have access to RAW. It's super powerful. This is another example of very bright areas up here. And if you were shooting this JPEG, you would not be able to recover any of that highlight detail whatsoever. With Camera Raw, we can. Still a little hot up there. If we take it all the way down, yeah, we're okay. There's enough there. We just take it down to roughly where we need it, and then we can open up the shadows a little down below on the landscape. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of shooting RAW? Well, one of the pros, obviously, as we've discussed and I've demonstrated, is the luminance range. The amount of luminosity from light, extreme light to extreme dark that the sensor can capture and the file can hold, and that you can have access to. Color temperature control, which is great for altering the mood of the images you're playing with. Distortion control to counteract any lens distortion. And you can use the RAW file as many times as you like. It's a non-destructive file. You can't do anything with it. You don't save into the RAW file. It just spits out a JPEG or a TIFF or something like that for you, and then you use that file. Now, what are some of the cons? Well, some of the cons are that the file sizes are going to be large. My Nikon D850, for example, and Z7 should create files that are up to 85 megabytes a piece. Storage, because your files are much larger, you need more storage. So you need SD cards that have a higher capacity, like 64 gig to 128 gig. You need more hard drives to then archive all of your files. And because of all that, it costs money. So you've got to spend more on higher capacity cards, more money on backup storage for archival purposes. But they're the only cons. The benefits, I believe, outweigh the cost, for sure. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is how to basically set that up in your camera. I'll use my Nikon as an example, but the menu structures are pretty much the same. You shouldn't have too much trouble trying to find the settings in your own camera. And I believe most compacts today are probably shooting RAW as well. Not necessarily high resolution like my Nikon. I also have an Olympus which shoots micro four thirds format, so it's a much smaller sensor, lower resolution, but it also shoots RAW as well, and it does an excellent job. So you don't have to have an expensive camera to shoot RAW. Okay, so here you can see this is the menu for my Nikon Z7. So what I'm going to do here is we'll find the RAW setting. It's the very top of the menu. We can go down to image quality, and you can see RAW is already set up in mine, of course. So we'd hit OK, and I've got a whole bunch of a selection of possibilities here. We can just save JPEG fine, high quality, JPEG normal, JPEG basic, TIFF format. We can go all the way up. You can just shoot RAW just by itself. So you can shoot RAW plus any of those JPEG options. But I just set mine to RAW, and then that's pretty much it. Image size is my RAW, and I'm setting my RAW to the largest possible file size. I can go medium and I can go small. So you can also alter the size of your file if you like. Now, as you can see there, it says 45.4 meg. So my RAW file sizes are approximately that, but that's because I've got a compression. I'm saving them with a non-destructive compression. What is that there? So there we go. So I've got RAW compression turned on. Lossless. Now I can compress that in a way that compresses more data, but I don't want to lose the information, so we go lossless. And what was the other setting back here? Oh, and bit depth. This also helps. You want to set this to the highest number possible. So 14-bit as opposed to 12-bit. Your camera may have an option of say 12-bit or 10-bit, for example. If in that case, go to 12-bit. And that's it. That's all you really need to do to find the RAW setting is just image quality, set it to RAW, and away you go. Okay, so here is my Gumroad page. I've got sky packs and painting tutorials. The sky packs might be of interest to you if you're a concept artist or a matte painter or a fine artist. They're all RAW. They're royalty-free RAW photos. Nikon, Sony, and Olympus formats mostly. I think there's some DNG, which is a generic RAW format. And I've got a combo pack up here, which is, let's have a look at that. So we've got two stormy skies, 2 sunsets, and cloudscapes. So, and that's pretty good value at only $30. So total 738 raw format, high-res photos. Check those out if you're interested. Maybe you don't have a camera that shoots RAW, but you want a bunch of skies in RAW format. You'll be able to use those straight away without any problems. So anyway, check them out. If you like what you're seeing today, hit the subscribe button, chuck us a like, and I'll catch you guys next time. In the meantime, take it easy.